Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I am pleased to welcome you all to the virtual event towards Education for All, Strengthening Data Systems in Conflict and Crisis Settings. This event is hosted by the Interagency Network for Education Emergencies, INEE, and the Education Research in Conflict and Protracted Crisis Consortium, ERICC. Thank you again for joining us. Together, we will delve into the technical and non-technical challenges of data generation and use in emergency settings. We'll also explore opportunities to strengthen education data systems in these settings. My name is Evan Satis, and I am an education economist working at the Global Partnership for Education as the lead on data and evidence. I am delighted to chair today's discussion and welcome a number of expert speakers whom I will introduce in a moment. We also encourage you to share your reflections and questions to the chat box throughout the event. But before I introduce the speakers, I would like to remind all of us that access to high quality and continuous education is a fundamental right for all children, including those affected by conflict and protracted crisis. Education is a major enabler for social and economic development, as we all know it. Yet we know from the new global estimates by Education Cannot Wait, 268 million children and adolescents across 73 countries are affected by a crisis, of which an estimated 72 million, I would say 1/4, are out of school, and 127 million, almost half, are enrolled in school but not achieving minimum proficiency levels in reading or math. We all know that there are a lot of efforts that exist to understand what works in education. For example, where I work at GPE, with we support research on scaling impact of innovations in education together with the International Development Research Center. And we also support research on other thematic areas through our Knowledge, Innovation, and Exchange Initiatives, KICS. We also promote evidence-based policy dialogue at country level to improve access and learning, working with governments, development partners, and civil society organizations. However, we know significant barriers and extensive gaps in evidence remain on what works, how and why specific interventions work to improve education outcomes in settings of conflict and crisis. The ERICC Research Program Consortium is also currently building a context-relevant and actionable evidence base, identifying most effective approaches for improving access, quality, and continuity of education in these settings. We will hear more from expert researchers from the ERICC Consortium soon, but I would like to also mention the fact that many of us here were also in attendance at the recent UNESCO conference of education data and statistics, where issues related to standards, methodologies, and efficiency of data collection, analysis, data sharing, and use in different country contexts were acknowledged and discussed. So we aim to follow up on some of these critical themes today, exploring key questions such as what education data system exists in conflict and crisis settings, and who is collecting such data, about whom and for whom, how and for what purpose. And we will also explore other questions such as to understand to what degree data systems that are being collected and analyzed are coherent and relevant for monitoring and evaluating existing policy priorities, talking about subnational level, national level, and international levels. And we will also try to understand the political, economy, and technical factors that either enable or constrain processes of the collection, analysis, sharing, and use of data to inform decision-making for policy and practice. So to help us navigate these questions, it is my privilege to introduce our presenters and speakers today. So our first speaker will be Maulana Salman Letelier. She is an education researcher at the Erbil Impact Lab at the International Rescue Committee. And she's also the cross-regional measurement lead and coordinator for the ERICC Consortium. She also serves as the research lead for the Mavis Nigeria EdTech and Feed Niger social emotional learning projects. And the second speaker, Olya Omonchuk, she is a senior research officer in Overseas Development Institute, ODI, and policy researcher for the ERICC Consortium. Her current work centers on education financing and political economy of education in conflict-affected and fragile contexts. Ola has managed policy evaluations on behalf of some of the UK government agencies in education and food programs. Ola has also researched child poverty policy reforms and early years interventions for families with complex needs. Our third speaker is Tomoya Sonoda. He currently works as Chief of Education at UNICEF Kyrgyzstan in Central Asia. He has over 17 years of experience in education research, planning and programming in development and humanitarian contexts. Tomoya holds a doctor in education degree from the University of College London Institute of Education. Our fourth speaker is Sirenia Chavez Villegas. She is an education officer at UNHCR, working in the area of data and evidence. She supports UNHCR education in strengthening its capacity to report on the state of refugee education for effective advocacy. She also supports the development of evidence products that serve as global public goods. She's an experienced mixed methods researcher and has carried out extensive work on refugee education, youth at risk, school-related violence, with a specific focus in Latin America and the Caribbean region. She has a PhD in development studies from the University of Cambridge. Our fifth speaker, Manos Antoninis, is currently the director of the Global Education Monitoring Report. He has been responsible for coordinating the financing gap estimates for the 2030 education targets, the projections of the achievement of universal primary and secondary education completion, and the World Inequality Database on Education. He is also a co-chair of the Technical Cooperation Group on SDG 4 indicators. Previously, he worked on public finance, monitoring and evaluation projects in education in various countries, as well as the country study of the Out-of-School Children Global Initiative in Indonesia. Then we will wrap up with Freya Perry, who is the education advisor for ERICC at FCDO, the United Kingdom Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. Freya served as the UK's policy lead during the COVID-19 pandemic, and most recently has worked in Pakistan, driving forward national data reforms and responding to the devastating floods in 2022. So we have a great panel for you today. Let's start with our first two speakers, Maulana and Olia, who will present emerging findings on EIE data systems from cross-country and political economy analysis. So while they are putting up the slides, I think they're already there. I would like to remind you that you're welcome to share your thoughts and questions in the chat box throughout the event. Maulana and Olia, you have the floor.
Thank you. 2.5 quintillion bytes of data are created every day. So how do we harness that to improve education in conflict-affected settings? I'm Marlena Salmon-Letelier on the ERICC team, and today we'll be thinking about that question. We'll think about the overarching challenges of data systems in conflict-affected settings, how they relate to the 3 ERICC Cohort 1 countries, and what we need to do next to move our collective work on data systems forward. Next slide. ERICC is a research consortium funded by FCDO that is working to strengthen evidence on education in crisis settings to understand what works and improve outcomes for children. Next slide. In order to generate research agendas for ERICC, country teams engaged in a country scan exercise where they interviewed stakeholders, reviewed the evidence, and mapped data systems. Today, we'll consider these findings alongside current data systems literature. Next slide. These are the 7 countries that are part of the ERICC project, with the Cohort 1 countries in dark blue. This is the first stage of a comparative analysis of data systems, and we'll soon have the data systems mappings for the other countries as well. Next slide. The 3 Cohort 1 countries include 3 very different settings. We have Nigeria, with high numbers of internally displaced persons living in host communities and others who are returning and resettling. Bangladesh, with segregated Rohingya refugees in the refugee camp Cox's Bazar, attending non-formal learning centers run by NGOs and learning from non-accredited home country curriculum. And Jordan, with Syrian refugees integrated into the regular education system, learning host country curriculum in double shift schools. Next slide. But before we get too deep into this, I want to tell you about something that I've always found magical: mail systems. You send something, it arrives how you want, hopefully, to a person anywhere in the country or world. Some mail systems work better than others. I want you to imagine for a moment that the pieces of mail are each a datum. Your mail system is the data system. How does it run? Is there timely, quality delivery? When there hasn't been, how has that affected you or others? Are there workers that know the context, a culture of mail usage, and transportation methods that work well in that context? How is the global matched with the local? Now, think of the average data system you've interacted with and imagine it as a mail system. I'm imagining some disconnections, inconsistencies, dysfunctional postal offices, data that don't arrive when they should and in the condition they were intended to. What would happen if we went in and tried to fix just one postal office? Or if we tried to fix only the way postcards are mailed, but not packages? It wouldn't work because it wouldn't fix the system. Yet that is what we do with data systems for a variety of reasons, and it's time to change that. Next slide. Today, I'll use a comparative lens to answer these three questions. 1, what are the data system issues in context of conflict and protracted crisis? 2, what is the state of the evidence about data systems in these contexts? And 3, what is needed next? Next slide. I reviewed many different sources exploring data systems and their problems in our field of work, and the same challenges come up again and again. In other words, we know what the problems are. I'll move on for now, but happy to come back to these during the discussion. Next slide. In the data systems mappings of each of the 3 cohort 1 countries, the challenges identified were unsurprising based on the literature. We see here limited data, data quality issues, and lack of coherence as common problems across the 3 countries, while safety, confidentiality, and security issues were identified in both Nigeria and Bangladesh, and capacity challenges and lack of clear definition, key targets, or indicators were identified in both Nigeria and Jordan. The specific challenges for each of these settings fully align with the literature, indicating we've probably reached a point of saturation in understanding the challenges. So what do we do with this? Next slide. While the literature is also full of wonderful overarching recommendations for how to address the challenges, here I've cited a few sources with recommendations that could help to address each of the challenges identified in the cohort 1 data systems mappings. Next slide. Due to time constraints, we'll dive into one of them today that was common across all 3 countries: limited data, or data that did not capture the full range of what was needed for effective data use. Next slide. The literature recommends that we prioritize local indigenous knowledge to further understand what needs to be fully captured, support development of new data collection tools that are field-based, user-friendly, light touch, and context-specific, expand data to identify outcomes, develop cross-sectional data processes for basic needs assessment, and develop complementary questions across sectors, and ensure that data gathered cover all dimensions of the disaster risk management cycle. Next slide. Now, your doctor tells you, hey, we know what's wrong. We have ideas of solutions, but we haven't tested it for someone like you. What do? Probably ask the doctor why that hasn't been done already. Next slide. A lot of the literature is at the level of identifying the needs and problems of data systems, but we didn't find much documenting how to design those interventions and test their impact. We need to take the next step of systematically testing data system solutions in different contexts. What works? For whom? What happens in the long term? Do we see changes in student outcomes when we implement certain solutions in the data system? Next slide. So we will continue to synthesize data from the 3 ERICC cohort 2 countries. And we as the field need to invest and conduct research on the impact of data systems strengthening interventions and determine whether they result in improved access, quality, and continuity of education and learning outcomes. Thank you. I'll pass it over to Olya.
Hello. Could we please switch to my slides? Thank you very much. My name is Olya Homonchuk, and I'm also part of the ERICC Research Consortium. I work at Overseas Development Institute in London, and I work on political economy analysis across our ERICC countries. Next slide. So the findings today I want to highlight come from 4 countries, including Syria, Bangladesh, South Sudan, and Nigeria. And while the work we do does not necessarily focus intentionally on data systems, we work on political economy analysis, you cannot talk about coordination in politics, of aid and responses in these really challenges environments if we don't talk about data sharing and data systems. Next slide. The core message is that if there's no data sharing, there's no coordination of resources. And we know that in conflict-affected contexts, humanitarian development and government sectors run programs that are 3, 5, 7 years long. And so if we cannot know what each of the other partners is doing, how are we supposed to ensure that all the children have equitable access to education? Next slide. Of course, as was mentioned in the beginning, there was just a big conference at UNESCO about education coordination and synchronizing. And so that can give an impression that there is a global level consensus that we should share data and that is the best practice. However, for many of us on this call, we know that in practice, there are still a lot of barriers to data sharing. And many of them are political, some are normative, and some are financial. Next slide. A really good example that stuck with me comes from Northwest Syria, where development and humanitarian actors, frankly, add to the complexity of the environment by having clashing norms about what education response should like and what are the aims of education. So on the one hand, we had the development sector who contracted a private provider to run one of the largest education projects, the Manahel project, which, as far as I know, is actually doing a pretty good job in improving learning outcomes for the schools where they're working. At the same time, the humanitarian sector actors on the ground were instructed from top layers of the humanitarian stream that they should not coordinate with the Manahel project based on the principle that humanitarians do not engage with the for-profit providers. This, of course, comes from really good intentions as well, because for-profit providers can, in theory, perpetuate inequalities and disadvantage children in harder to reach areas even further. What this means in practice is that the development sector was excluded from coordination meetings for a very long time. And there was no capacity to share basic data, such as which schools the Manahelis project is working in versus which schools are the humanitarians working in. This led to inequitable distribution of resources, whereby urban locations, including public and camp education, receiving double funds in some cases, and then more difficult to reach areas receiving none. Next slide. In addition to inefficient use of resources, and we know that there's a very limited financial budget for education in protracted crisis, this creates a feeling or an experience of oppression by the global north. And this is something I didn't necessarily expect to hear with such deep passion from respondents on the ground. But for local respondents, NGOs, civil society who risk their lives to help families and children who are experiencing war for such a long time, to not be able to share basic data, for them, it seems like yet another oppressive regime. And one interviewer said that, I've experienced Assad regime where I was not able to share data or say what we're doing, and everything had to be done under the table. Why is it that now the humanitarian sector, who's supposed to help us survive and live a better life, now we have to have a similar experience where we share the numbers about the schools we work in under the table? Why can't we create safe platforms to share data? Next slide. And because of the limited time, I'm going to remind you the importance of, in addition to the technical solutions and online platforms, just how important are the political, financial, and normative incentives for all the actors. At the national level, data transparency has political consequences, and Nigeria was a very good example of that, where UNESCO published an estimate that there were 20 million out-of-school children. Of course, the news articles came out and blaming the government and saying how poorly they're doing. Well, the government pushed back, interestingly, using the World Bank data, which estimated that only 7 to 10 million children are out of school. And this makes me think, well, first of all, how can we lobby and advocate for something if we do not have even similar estimates across different development actors? And secondly, how can we encourage countries to be transparent if anytime there is news on education, on learning outcomes or out-of-school children, there's such a big political consequences and a backlash? We do not want to shame national governments. We want to incentivize them to disclose the data. Next slide. Similarly, if we look at Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh, data collection efforts often reflect financial incentives in the system. So the funding renewal and bidding for funding incentivizes collection of data around attendance and around the numbers of enrolled students. Currently, or at least through our research, we didn't see any incentives for providers to collect learning data. There is no financial incentive or any recognition for those who share and coordinate data and so forth. And this maybe is a very market idea, but given how everybody's really stretched and has a massive workload, it is very natural that if we do not reward people for collecting data on learning outcomes, not everyone is going to do it. Next slide. And lastly, this is probably the most important point that I hope you will remember is what value do we bring to communities? Because in many cases, there's already a survey fatigue, such as a case in Borno State, Nigeria, where many of the community gatekeepers refuse for surveys to take place. Of course, most of the official explanation is that these are very challenging environments. It's too dangerous to survey, which is of course true. However, there is part of the challenge is that communities do not see any value of repeatedly taking part in surveys because they do not see how these surveys link to improvement of education in schools where their children are enrolled. In Borno State, only 7 out of 27 local authorities are included in the national survey. And we know that one of the key challenges is that the federal level funding is not supporting religious schools. Meanwhile, these communities see these schools as a legitimate form of education and would like for their children to continue attending this form of education. Next slide. Key takeaways that technical solutions and formal strategies are of course necessary, but insufficient to promote data synchronization and data sharing. Good on paper technical solutions typically fail if they're not supported with incentives for all key stakeholders at the national level, at the level of education providers, as well as communities. So these are families and key gatekeepers. And that lack of coordination between humanitarian and development sectors is a major source of inefficiencies, gaps in education coverage, and duplication efforts, which is unfortunate, but also encouraging because we do have agency and we can improve the response even in a challenging context such as Syria, South Sudan, or Cox's Bazar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Malana and Ola. We will now dig deeper into the political and technical aspects with Tomoya Sonada. You have the floor.
Great, thank you, Ivan. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you very much for this opportunity. So let me share my field experience in Syria, Damascus in Syria, very much focusing on the politics of data. So before Kyrgyzstan, I spent 8 years in the Middle East, 4 years in Damascus, and 4 years in Amman in Jordan in response to Syrian refugee crisis. And then at that time, when I was in Damascus, I did a doctoral research on this topic at the University College London. And I did a semi-structured interview with 38 practitioners and then like donors and other government officials. So let me share a couple of interesting quotes from them. So next slide, please. So some of you may be very familiar with this kind of like a data analytics and then severity rankings for prioritization, target selection, and financial accountability. And then when I had a conversation with those aid professionals and donor officials, they very much appreciate this kind of data analytics and empirical data for their decision-making process. So so somehow we see some faith in the what works agenda and also to some extent, some trust in numbers. Next slide, please. But as you may see, especially in political conflict settings like Syria, we also face some different forms of politicization of data and evidence. So let me focus on 3 forms. One is data fabrication. And the second, political data interpretation. And the third one is selective use and non-use of data. So data fabrication means you can construct any official statistics like population estimate and EMIS data based on your political wills. The third one, political data interpretation. So you can understand any data, again, in favor of your particular values and assumptions. Then selective use means selective, like I'm talking about cherry picking, like you can selectively use and deliberately neglect particular inconvenient data. Next slide, please. So let me more elaborate these forms. So data fabrication. So, in conflict settings, contesting parties like Syrian government and Western pro-opposition donors, they kind of like they have different mandate and different values within the education sector in Syria. And then, for example, in particular case, Daraya is kind of like a suburb of Damascus city, which was under siege. So UN did some estimation. So Daraya population should be like 4,000 people in need of assistance. But a lot of like opposition, like activists or opposition groups said that no, 4,000 is not correct. Daraya has at least like 12,000 people suffering from the bombing from the government, Syrian government. But the government said, no, that number is outrageous. Daraya has only 200 terrorists. So in this way, people can easily construct particular data or numbers based on their belief. And so that's quite common, especially in political conflict. And then even in education, UNICEF and sector partners estimated like a 2.1 million out of school children in 2013-14, based on the EMIS data and analysis. But Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Education easily disregarded those numbers, saying that no, 2.2 million is too much, and only 1 million children out of school without any technical reference. So this kind of like a data fabrication was happening. The next slide, please. In the same way, pro-opposition donors, Western donors, did a similar kind of like a politicization of data. So, for example, one of the Western major donor colleagues said that we've continued working with the UN and NGOs, but they're only supporting the children in need in opposition areas, not government control areas. So even though you show any like good quality of data, you cannot make sense of that, the figures. Instead, you still have to follow some kind of like political agenda and political like mandate. And even like when you do some calculation, some political values seep into that process of data calculation. The second quote said that the severity scale calculation formula was also politically affected by the donors. So some of the colleagues mentioned that. Next slide, please. And then this is a cherry picking or like a policy-based evidence practice. So even aid agencies like UN agencies and NGO partners can also somehow complicitly engage in some kind of like a politicization of data. And as some of you may be like facing this situation, like you're also under pressure to deliver results or reach out to the the people in need of assistance as many as possible. So in this case, you have to be accountable to the donors. Then you may focus on tangible and measurable outputs rather than like inconvenient situations. So in Syria, for example, the second quote, some children moved from opposition areas to government control areas to participate in exam certification. It's a very good initiative. However, the UN also got to know that some of the children, when they move, they cross the line between opposition areas and government control areas. Some of the young people were captured by the police, and some of them like escaped, so they disappeared. So that somehow, yeah, so we could, the donors cannot share such inconvenient or sensitive information with the donors to protect themselves. So this kind of things, so somehow selective, selective in terms of data sharing. The next slide, please. So this is the last one. Okay, sorry. So let me quick wrap up, so that it's very important to think about data literacy is very important for all of us. And then we need to think about what data we are talking about, and then what data don't tell us. And then that kind of methodology is very, very important. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Tomoya. We are lagging behind a little bit. Sirenia, it's your turn now. Yeah.
Yep. Thank you so much. So hi, everyone. This is Sirenia, Education Officer from UNHCR. Super conscious of time, I wanted to speak to two questions that were posed. The first question is about what education data systems exist in conflict and crisis context and the purpose of this data. So for UNHCR, I think it's important to understand that refugees are being hosted not exclusively in conflict and crisis settings, and that refugees on average are estimated to spend about 10.3 years outside of their countries of origin, a period that extends the education life cycle. In this regard, there are, I think, two separate answers to the question on whether education data systems exist in conflict and crisis settings. At the onset of a crisis, in the early stages of a crisis, it's common for humanitarian actors, and not just UNHCR, of course, to collect data to estimate, for example, populations in need, so PIN. This is often done through sort of disparate data collection tools and assessments, including, for example, multi-sector needs assessments, in which education is one of several components of the questions. Though there are standardized questions that can be used in these, in practice, it is not often the case that questions across different settings are harmonized, making it difficult to produce comparable statistics across contexts. In a recent analysis that was published by UNESCO, where they reviewed more than 1,000 data collection exercises in the top 35 hosting refugee countries, it became clear that there's a marked focus on asking questions about education access, which means that other dimensions of education, such as quality and school safety environments, are not as commonly or typically addressed. The second part of my answer to this question is that in settings of protracted displacement, where refugees have been in a country for, say, 5, 10 years or longer, we don't necessarily talk about data collection at the onset of a crisis. In this case, and according to our own UNHCR strategy for education for 2030, we advocate for the inclusion of refugees in national education systems. Where this is the case, and the data from the latest Global Compact on Refugees Indicator report shows us that most countries have policies and legislation that allow for refugees to access the national education system, even though we know that many practical barriers still remain. Refugees are part and are accessing the national education system. It therefore becomes the purview of governments and ministries of education to collect this data. From the UNHCR side, we advocate where it is technically feasible and possible to do so, for MOEs to collect data that is disaggregated by protection status or a useful proxy such as nationality. And we have seen many examples where governments have shown goodwill and have taken on this task in countries like Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, which host a high proportion of Venezuelans displaced abroad. Governments collect data on the nationality of students in their MS, and they're therefore able to produce education statistics from their school census that generate figures on Venezuelan students specifically. In other countries like, for example, Chad and South Sudan, they ask about the number of refugees in their school census surveys, making it technically possible to produce statistics that are specific to refugees. These are the sort of practices that UNHCR encourages other countries to adopt, especially where there is a high caseload of refugees. And then the second question that I sort of wanted to address in this intervention was about the extent to which refugee education data informs education policies and programs, and to what degree it's helping to keep different stakeholders accountable. So several points in this regard. I think the first point is that policy questions around whether legislation for refugees to access education is favorable helps us understand in just very general terms where countries stand on this issue. And it is very useful in holding countries accountable to the commitments that were made in the Global Compact for Refugees, the GCR. The data from our latest GCR report, which is publicly available and on our webpage, indicates that in general, there is a favorable policy environment in regards to education access, and very few countries have restrictive policies that bar or prevent refugees from accessing national schools, though, like I said before, many practical barriers still remain. And while legislation is only one dimension that contributes to access, it is an important one. The second point is that the data we collect on an annual basis for the production of our flagship refugee education report, also publicly available, provides a snapshot of access to the different levels of education access in reporting countries. The number of countries that have reported for this exercise have increased over the years. We started with only 12 countries reporting access figures in 2020, prior to me joining UNHCR, to more than 70 refugee hosting countries providing figures in 2023, providing us with a more complete picture on the state of access to education for refugees. This data is crucial in decision-making since it tells us to what degree refugees are able to access education. We don't publish all of the country-specific enrollment rates in our reports. We have this data and it allows us to understand where education access is lagging the most and where more sectoral education-specific support programs and interventions are needed to ensure children have access to school. And it also allows us to determine how much disparity there is in access rates between the host country population and the people we serve, and where we need to advocate with governments to increase that access. And I think I'll stop there, Evans. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Serenia. So we just covered perspectives from country level and also from a specific area regarding refugee education. Now, Manos, you have the floor for the global perspective.
Thank you very much. So indeed, time is precious. Let's move directly to the next slide. I'm going to talk about comparable data. In the case of education in emergencies, it's true that there are just so many different angles and different organizations involved have different needs and capacities. They have different understandings of data and different purposes of using data. So I'm going to focus on a very narrow aspect that is usually not of primary concern for organizations involved in emergencies, and that is comparable data. It's not a priority for often obvious reasons, costs. There are other urgent things to do, and it's also not feasible without shortcuts, and that requires some coordination. That's the one we're trying to provide. So the UNESCO Conference on Education Data and Statistics was mentioned earlier. Indeed, we discussed two possible approaches in trying to improve data consistency on the headline indicators like the out-of-school rate. And there are two ways of looking at that. One is the bottom-up approach, and there has been a decision of the conference to try and develop protocols and standards to capture the impact of emergencies and crises on affected populations. There is scope to improve this, even though I recognize the presentation earlier talking about the political constraints that exist. So in that sense, we also need a top-down approach, and that's the one I'm going to focus on. So if we go to the next slide, there has been a demand for a very long time, and I'm referring now to also the debate that has been going on in parallel in the chat, for a methodology that would combine data sources to estimate out-of-school rates. That was raised already almost 20 years ago, a composite approach that would combine these different sources in order to produce time series that would be consistent over time. So using administrative data has been challenging in many countries with out-of-school rates, including countries that have conflicts, where enrollment records are incomplete, where population data and age data are not very well captured, and where, of course, there's very low school capacity to capture individual student ages accurately. So UNESCO, the Institute for Statistics and the Global Education Monitoring Report that at the end of the day have the mandate, because I heard earlier the World Bank being mentioned as a source of data, but of course the World Bank does not have the mandate for that coordination, so it's important to remember that. And there are no different indicators. I think Sylvia so mentioned there are different indicators. There's no different indicators. There's one indicator, which is commonly agreed. So in order to improve the reporting on that, a cohort model was developed that combines these different sources in a coherent and consistent way. And following the TCG decision, our coordination intergovernmental group on SDG 4 indicators, these model estimates are used for regional and global aggregates, and also for national figures when the country has not been able to report for very long, for at least 5 years. There maybe some of you are familiar with the estimates that in 2022 we estimated 250 million children were out of school, and for the first time that was an increase because of Afghanistan. Moving to the next slide, you see a bit of a sense. You get a bit of a sense from this graph, different points, different data points from different sources that produce sometimes consistent, sometimes less consistent trends. But what you also see, in this case, Ethiopia, is that data essentially stop. There's no data point after 2016 in Ethiopia. And that is a major problem then that we face when we talk about education in emergencies. The model is expected to be relatively stable. So when there's a crisis somewhere and we don't have information, then things, of course, don't work as well as we would have liked. In Afghanistan, when there was such a crisis, we were lucky to have the mixed survey that provides us data on the situation, but that's an exception and not the rule. So let's go to the next slide. What essentially we have tried to do just for this presentation is to see how would such an estimate, a global estimate, be adjusted if we looked at the most serious crisis at the moment for which we may not have sufficiently good information. I picked the 5 top crises according to the IRC's watch list, not 2034, 2024, I hope. And Sudan is, of course, the top one. Our model had estimated that there were 5.4 million out of school children in 2022. We have validated that with actual data from 2022. But of course, after the conflict erupted, there has been a massive displacement crisis, at least centered in 3 regions. And our estimate is that perhaps based on the humanitarian records that we have received, that 4.2 million children should be added to that estimate. In Palestine, of course, we know that none of the 550,000 children in Gaza have been to school. That would not have been captured in any other way other than an ad hoc adjustment. And in South Sudan, our estimate was that there were 2.1 million or 60% of out-of-school children in 2022, but we know the data are very weak. There is a cluster estimate that would highlight, that would suggest that another 700,000 may need to be added to that estimate. For conflicts in Burkina Faso and Myanmar, and I see there were also people from both countries attending, we have some information, but it's not sufficient. It's not enough to justify changing our estimate because we feel that maybe we have enough, either we have enough information in the case of Burkina, or we don't have anything really credible enough to suggest that we can take the numbers that have been circulating in humanitarian debates. So the last slide to conclude, as you saw from this analysis of 5 major crises, or at least the 3 that had reasonably comparable information, they suggest that the out-of-school population may be underestimated by 5.5 million children. Now, how we do that systematically and not in the way I presented is, of course, the question. Each crisis is different in terms of characteristics such as their intensity, the spreads, the geographical spread, the duration, but also in terms of data availability. And we know, of course, that clusters estimate the number of people in need of education, but this is different to the out-of-school definition, and it is hard to integrate such findings. After all, the purpose of this data collection is not necessarily the purpose of global reporting. It's other priorities that need to be satisfied. But more can be done, and I think that's an open call that the Conference on Education Data and Statistics issued to at least cross-check the information that comes from humanitarian agencies and take them into account when they can be triangulated with references to other sources. And with that, I would like to thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Manos. We will wrap up now with Freya.
Hi, thanks so much, and what a wonderful and interesting discussion. So I'm here today representing FCDO. I lead our Education Research and Conflict and Crisis Programme, ERICC, which has been funding some new rigorous research on the most effective approaches to education delivery in emergencies and protracted crisis. And you can now find some of that research on the INEE website, so do check it out after this webinar. I think there are two key issues that jump out at me from this discussion. And the first is that we need to be better at coordinating data on participation. And the second is that we need to be more ambitious on advancing data for learning. So firstly, for better data on student participation, we need to take a closer look at how that data is being used by local and global actors. In my professional experience, the quality of data is so closely interlinked with how it's being used or not being used. And when there are regular data routines which can inform decision-making and have repercussions for, say, financial allocations, then the accuracy of data is much improved. A key area for further study and action is how we approach data sharing and data protection in this space, which can either help or hinder data-driven decision-making and feedback loops. So I think this is a fundamental question to answer some really important basic questions like who are we reaching and what is the level of need. So I spent the last few years working in Pakistan, where there is a wealth of education data, but historically it's not being used. And when we looked into this, we found that one of the key issues around it was that there were no clear protocols on how to share data, and that this contributed to departments working in silos. So while there was really good learning outcome data, it wasn't being shared with the curriculum department or the textbook department or the teacher training department, and so not informing key policies and programming. One of the things we worked on over the last few years is through technical assistance, providing support to the government to develop data protocols and agreed national data standardization framework, very much aligned with UIS. And that's resulted in data being more proactively shared and used across departments at provincial level, and is now also informing some resource allocations at the federal level. But even with this kind of progress at a system level, when the flooding happened in 2022, the sector fell back into a project mindset. It inadequately used the government data that was available, the data systems that already existed, and new systems and data sets were set up in tandem that didn't speak to one another. So it's really important that as a sector, we come together and agree some common principles and data sharing frameworks that are ready for when a crisis hits, so that we can share information securely at the right level and at the right time, so that we know who we're reaching and who is being left behind. And secondly, as a sector, we need to prioritize learning. I think that's kind of not really been discussed too much in this presentations today. But the UN estimates that globally 224 million school-aged children are affected by crises. And of these, 70 million children are not in school, but a further 127 million are in school and not learning. That's a huge number. And this emerging research from ERICC, it finds that too few organizations are collecting data on learning outcomes. In Cox's Bazar, for example, the ERICC study found that just 16% of agencies that were surveyed were collecting data on literacy attainment. And of course, education services provide so many benefits in emergency contexts, including vital child protection mechanisms. But learning really needs to be at the center of what we do when the average humanitarian crisis is lasting 9 years. And education is seen as a driver for hope for a different kind of future for so many affected families. In my view, the data on grade transition that most agencies collect is not really a good enough proxy for whether children are achieving the learning to enable them to progress. And some of this ERICC research is also highlighting that there is a lack of reliable data on continuity of learners. It shows that many agencies are admitting new learners to maintain kind of class sizes, but without really addressing the root causes of why kids are dropping out. And we know from other contexts that learning is often, or the lack of learning is often closely connected with that dropout. So if we are starting to prioritize learning, where do we start? In our view, probably we would start with assessing learning in the early grades. In particular, this plays a really critical role in advancing the global commitment to improve attainment of foundational skills. Elsewhere, FCDO has expressed its concern about the downgrading of SDG 4.1.A, which is the indicator assessing the proportion of students in grades 2 and 3 meeting the minimum proficiency levels in reading and maths. And this needs to remain a priority in development settings, but we also need to double down our efforts to collect this data in emergency contexts. Why? We know that inequalities start early and they widen as children progress through school. We also know that even short-term gaps in education attendance lead to significant learning losses, and that those are the greatest for children with emerging literacy and numeracy needs. So measuring foundational skills in the early grades is really key to understanding learning trajectories and informing effective programming, including in emergency and protracted crisis contexts. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Wow, that was very rich. It was quite interesting. So we only have 8 minutes left. Let's see how many questions we can take. We will try our best. We will start with the first question for any panelists. How can we build the confidence of parents and educators to support children to continue with their education even after conflict strike? I don't know if any of the panelists would like to come in quickly on this one.
I can quickly come in.
Please, great, thanks. Please go ahead.
I think there's so many, like, parents are very vocal about what they want education to achieve, and we need to continue with our efforts to consult with the communities when we design the programs, and consult and understand why they might be dropping out and what the causes are, and not assume that we know the answers. So listening to parents of why they do want to send their children to school and what was the driver of dropping out.
Thank you. That was very quick and concise. The other question I would like to bring here is for Marlana. Is there data on the number of IDP children in Nigeria and what interventions have been carried out in IDP camps to provide access to education? So much has been said for refugees, but what about IDPs?
So we do have some data on IDPs, but it's not extensive. And I'm not the person to answer that question. We would need to go to the Nigeria team to get that for you. But we definitely don't have enough data on what's being done for IDPs and what works in getting them back in school and making sure that they have access to education.
Okay. Thanks. We will have one last question. It's probably for you again, Maulana, or about the incentives. Can you please explain the point on providing incentives for data collection a bit further?
Yes, sure. So we're still working, and these were emerging findings based on 4 case studies. And the next step for us is to understand what's going on in Lebanon and Jordan. And then after that, we will workshop with practitioners and like our suggestions for incentives. We want to make sure we consult with practitioners. However, one example is building on what Freya said and connecting that with my presentation. Only 16% of providers in Cox's Bazar are collecting data on learning outcomes, and we found no incentives. However, data on access is collected regularly, because to renew their contract every 6 months to a year, NGOs have to renew their contract. And if they did not have the data to show how many students attended, they would not be able to access funding. Can we also include something in our funding structures about learning, not in a punitive way, but in a way of encouraging and rewarding organizations for going an extra mile, an extra step to collect the data? Can we reward NGOs that actually collaborate and share data with other organizations, or synchronize their instruments and use the same indicators? there's a lot of creative opportunities, like a lot of creative solutions we can come up with. So I'll pass it on as well to all of you in all the different countries that you're working. What would be a good incentive?
Great, thank you. So we have 3 questions that I will group together. It's around out of school children in general. For all panelists, maybe Manos could come here. So the first one is around whether we have data on how on the progress we've made to reduce the numbers of out of school children, but also around the methodology. And as well as how we could improve data sharing. So yeah, Manos, maybe I put you on the spot, but you can definitely share some insights.
Sure, just share the
yeah.
response also in the chat box. Of course, you can compare trends between conflict-affected countries and other countries. One quick reference, if you want to go to, is the GPE results report, which the GEM report and the UIS are contributing every year. And there, all the statistics are presented comparing the 2 sets of countries, at least among the GP development country partners. The data, I will type the link. You can go to the VIEW website, which I refer to in my presentation. And there you can also have access to the technical documentation of the paper that is behind the model. And you can also experiment looking at the graphs like the one I showed on Ethiopia on every country in the world, basically.
Great. I think that we have covered most of the questions, and some of them, I think, responses have been provided in the chat. We will stop with the questions now. I think at this stage, I have to thank all the expert speakers. Really, that was very insightful, and also to all the audience participants for your time and sharing your reflections and questions. What I heard today is we need to acknowledge the fact that we have technical issues and we have non-technical issues. And so the solutions, they have to be aligned to that. So to the non-technical and the technical challenges that we've seen. So we need to really think about effective incentives for better coordination and collaboration. The question around data sharing was raised, and the need to improve the quality assurance of the data we generate in general, especially in emergency settings, and also the needs to support country ownership. At the end of the day, the goal is not to generate data for the sake of it, but is to really improve access and learning for all children. And I think the last presenter did mention the fact that we have a lot of work to do around learning assessment and make sure that and track children's progress and make sure that they learn even in those difficult settings. It was a very great discussion. Even myself, I learned a lot. I hope it was the same for everyone. As we wrap up, we are leaving with more food for thoughts on ways forward to forge collaboration and progress towards strengthening data systems in education emergencies. A little bit of housekeeping, please do get in touch with one of us or with any of the colleagues from the ERICC Consortium or from the INEE Data Working Group, and with other field events and conferences on the horizon. We look forward to seeing one another soon. And I wish you all well until then. Thank you very much. We even gained 1 minute from the 60 minutes we're supposed to spend together. Have a good day or a good evening, depending on where you are. Thank you.